Wales, 1978. The hills rolled in silence that year, thick with mist and secrets. In the small village of Corndu, where everyone knew everyone's name, two little girls began to speak in words that made no sense to anyone but each other. Isla and Era Morgan were 6 when the first whispers began, odd, lilting sounds that didn't match the rhythm of any known language, yet carried the eerie precision of meaning. It began with laughter, light, harmless, and familiar. The kind of laughter only children make when the world still feels like a secret meant for them alone. The Morgan twins, Isla and Era, were rarely apart, their matching blonde braids and solemn grey eyes making them seem less like two children and more like reflections of the same one. They lived with their parents in a weathered farmhouse on the edge of Corndu, where the moors stretched wide and wild, and the air was always damp with the scent of peat and rain. People in the village often said the twins were peculiar in the best way, though no one could quite explain what they meant by that, until the day their laughter turned into something else. It was their mother, Catherine Morgan, who noticed it first. She had been peeling potatoes by the window when she heard the girls whispering in the garden. At first, she thought they were singing. There was rhythm in it, a rise and fall that almost resembled a lullaby. But when she stepped outside, she froze. The words weren't Welsh, nor English, nor any mixture she could recognize. They flowed like a stream over stones, too quick, too fluid. Isla would say something, a cluster of sounds that bent and curved in ways language shouldn't, and Era would reply instantly, nodding as if she understood every syllable. Catherine stood there, her hands slick with starch, and listened until the hair at the back of her neck lifted. That night, she told her husband, Gareth, about it. He chuckled, saying it was just a twin thing, a private tongue like some children invent. He reminded her that twins often made up words only they understood, that it was harmless. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't play. The sound of it had followed her into the house, echoing in her ears even after she closed the window. It wasn't just the strangeness of the words, it was the tone. The girls hadn't sounded like they were pretending. They'd sounded intentional, like they were remembering something long forgotten. Over the following weeks, the language grew. It crept into everything the twins did. They spoke it while drawing at the kitchen table, while playing with their dolls, even while brushing their teeth at night. Sometimes they'd switch mid-sentence from English into that strange tongue, their voices soft but firm, as though obeying some quiet rule. When their father asked them to repeat what they'd said, they would exchange a quick look, half mischief, half warning, and simply shake their heads. The villagers began to notice too. The school teacher, Mrs. Llewellyn, wrote home one afternoon, saying the twins had started whispering to each other during lessons. They'd sit side by side, heads tilted inward, murmuring while the rest of the class worked. When Mrs. Llewellyn asked them to stop, they would, but the look in their eyes unsettled her. It wasn't defiant. It was distant, as though they'd been interrupted mid-prayer. By late autumn, their language had developed its own rhythm. Catherine started recording bits of it on a small tape deck she used for family notes. When she played it back later, she realized the pattern wasn't random. There were repeated syllables, tonal rises that resembled questions, and pauses that seemed deliberate. It was a language, structured, complex, alive. But no matter how many linguists or teachers she asked, no one could identify even a single root word. Then came the first dream. Era woke screaming one night, her small hands clutching the blanket so tightly that her knuckles went white. When Catherine rushed in, she found both girls sitting upright, eyes wide open, speaking rapidly in that same strange speech. Only this time, their voices didn't sound like children's voices anymore. They were deeper, older, and perfectly synchronized, each syllable landing in unison. The air in the room felt wrong, too heavy, too still. and when Gareth burst in, the word stopped instantly. Both girls turned toward him at the same time, their heads tilting in the same angle, and said in perfect English, "We were only remembering." The next morning, they acted as if nothing had happened. They played in the garden, laughed, and asked for porridge as usual. But something in the way they moved had changed. Their gestures mirrored each other perfectly, every blink and breath timed as though rehearsed. Even their footsteps on the wooden floors fell in rhythm. Catherine started noticing smaller things after that. When one twin got hurt, a scraped knee, a splinter, the other would flinch before she even saw the wound. Once, when Era cut her finger on a piece of glass, Isla, who was upstairs, gasped and dropped her teacup at the exact same moment. The two of them began finishing each other's sentences not just in words, but in actions. One would reach for something the other had already begun to move toward. It was as if they shared the same pulse. The language itself grew darker. There was less laughter in it now, more murmuring. They no longer spoke it in front of their parents but whispered it in their room after dark. Catherine could hear it through the walls, soft, breathy tones that would rise suddenly into something sharp, almost like chanting. Once, she crept to their door and pressed her ear against it. What she heard chilled her blood. Between the flowing syllables, she could swear she heard another sound, faint but distinct, a low hum, echoing their voices like a third speaker. When she opened the door, both girls stopped mid-sentence and turned slowly toward her. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. They stared at her for what felt like an eternity before Isla smiled faintly and said, "We can't teach you. You wouldn't hear it right." No one in the village could explain it. The priest suggested a blessing, the doctor suggested rest. But neither helped. The twins' connection only deepened, their language growing more elaborate by the day. The more they spoke it, the more they withdrew from everyone else. Soon, it became rare to hear their voices in English at all. The villagers began to whisper that perhaps the girls weren't speaking that language at all, but remembering it, recalling something that didn't belong to this world, something that had only been waiting for the right voices to speak it again. The Morgans' farmhouse had always stood a little apart from the rest of Corndu, perched on the edge of a slope that overlooked the moors. In summer, the grass around it grew long and pale, brushing against the stone walls like whispering fingers. In winter, the mist swallowed it whole, leaving only the rooftop and the faint glimmer of the attic window visible through the fog. For generations, the land had belonged to the Morgan family, and people in the village often joked that the house itself was stubborn, that it refused to change, even when everything else around it did. But after the twins began speaking their strange language, the house started to feel different, as if it too were listening. At first, it was small things. The radio in the kitchen, an old crackling box that only ever caught one or two local stations, began turning on by itself late at night. Sometimes, Catherine would wake to hear it murmuring softly, not with music or broadcasts, but with static that pulsed in a rhythm, 3 bursts, a pause, then 2 more. When she'd enter the kitchen, the moment she flicked on the light, it would stop. Gareth blamed faulty wiring, though every time he checked, the cord was unplugged. The animals, too, seemed uneasy. The Morgans kept hens and a small flock of sheep, but by early November, several of them had gone missing. The ones that remained grew skittish, refusing to graze near the eastern field. When Gareth finally went to see why, he found strange markings there, patches of flattened grass arranged in perfect circles, too neat to have been made by wind or hooves. In the center of each circle, the ground felt oddly warm, as though the earth had been breathing. He said nothing to the neighbors, not wanting to invite gossip, but he came home that night with mud up to his knees and a look Catherine had never seen on his face before. Inside the house, the twins' language took on a heavier presence. It wasn't just something they spoke, it was something that lingered. Catherine could hear it echo faintly even when the girls weren't in the room, as if the walls themselves had memorized the sound. Sometimes, when she was alone in the kitchen, she'd hear soft fragments of it behind her, whispers that stopped the instant she turned around. On one occasion, she caught her own reflection in the window moving just a heartbeat too late, her lips shaping sounds she didn't make. The villagers began to keep their distance. What had once been curiosity turned into quiet avoidance. People crossed the street when they saw Catherine in town, and children who used to play with the twins now hurried past their gate without looking in. Mrs. Llewellyn stopped sending notes home, and when Catherine asked why the girls hadn't been given new assignments, the teacher only said they worked better on their own. The school's headmaster even suggested that perhaps homeschooling might be more fitting for such gifted children, though his voice carried an unease that betrayed the polite phrasing. The isolation pressed in on the family like a fog. Gareth threw himself into farm work, though his hands trembled more these days, and his eyes often drifted toward the woods beyond the property line. Catherine took to keeping candles lit in every room, convinced the light somehow steadied the air. The twins seemed unaffected, or perhaps too affected to notice. They spent hours in the attic, speaking their secret tongue to the rhythm of the rain tapping against the roof. One evening, Catherine climbed the narrow stairs to bring them supper, but when she reached the door, she stopped. The air felt charged, the way it does before a thunderstorm. Through the thin wood, she could hear the girls whispering again, but it wasn't just the two of them this time. There was another sound, something faint and overlapping, like the same words being repeated just after theirs, but coming from deeper in the walls. When she finally opened the door, the twins were sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing each other. Between them lay one of Catherine's hand mirrors, its glass catching the dim light from the small window. Isla was murmuring softly, her voice steady and low, while Era watched her reflection, not blinking. The moment Catherine stepped inside, the whispering stopped, and both girls turned toward her in perfect unison. "We were listening," Era said, her voice calm. Isla nodded beside her, adding, "It talks clearer when it's dark." That night, Catherine and Gareth argued for the first time in years. She wanted to take the girls away for a while, perhaps stay with her sister in Swansea, somewhere bright, somewhere with noise and people. Gareth refused. "This is their home," he said. "They'll be fine. They just need time." But as he spoke, the kitchen lights flickered, and from upstairs came a sound, a soft, drawn-out hum that neither of them could mistake for wind. It was a note, perfectly held, the same sound Catherine had heard echoing in the attic earlier. Gareth didn't finish his sentence. The next few weeks passed in a kind of uneasy stillness. Visitors stopped coming altogether. Letters arrived but went unanswered. The house seemed to close itself off from the world, its windows always a little fogged, its halls always just a little too cold. Even the clock in the sitting room began to tick out of rhythm, its pendulum swinging a fraction slower than before. Catherine noticed that every morning, without fail, she would wake to find both twins standing by the front window, watching the fields as if expecting someone. When she asked what they were looking for, they only said, "It moves closer when the sun comes up." One evening, when the wind was sharp and the moon barely visible, a neighbor named Rhys Evans came knocking. He'd been checking his traps near the Morgan's boundary and thought he'd seen movement, two small figures walking hand in hand along the tree line. He swore they were humming, though he couldn't make out the tune. When Catherine asked what time it had been, he hesitated. "Just before dawn," he said finally. "But it didn't look like dawn to me. The light was wrong. Too grey. Too still." After that, even Gareth stopped pretending nothing was wrong. He nailed the attic door shut, though neither he nor Catherine ever found the courage to ask where the mirror had gone. The circles in the field grew larger, darker, as if burned into the earth. and though no one ever saw the twins leave the house after dark, the villagers began claiming they could hear voices on the wind when they passed the Morgans' property, two high, lilting tones, repeating a pattern that almost sounded like laughter, carried just beyond the reach of understanding, fading each time someone tried to listen too closely. The winter of 1978 fell hard over Corndu, a season of pale skies and nights that never seemed to end. Snow came early, sealing the narrow roads and burying the moorland in quiet. The Morgan farmhouse stood isolated beneath a thick quilt of frost, its windows filmed with ice so dense they reflected only shapes and shadows. Inside, the hearth burned low, the light soft and orange against the dark beams. It was during this quiet, heavy stretch of cold that the twins began their mirror game, though no one knew to call it that until it was far too late. It started innocently, as many strange things do. Catherine noticed one afternoon that the girls had dragged her old vanity mirror out of the attic and set it by the parlor window. The mirror was tall, framed in carved oak, with glass slightly clouded from age. It had belonged to Catherine's grandmother and had always made her uneasy. She'd caught odd flickers in it as a child, moments where her reflection had seemed just a breath behind. The twins sat before it for hours, facing their own images, whispering softly to one another. When their mother asked what they were doing, Isla replied, "We're learning how to listen." At first, Catherine thought it was only pretend. The girls were imaginative, clever, perhaps they'd turned the mirror into part of some private ritual, the way children invent invisible friends. But then, she began to notice details that didn't fit the ordinary. The twins' lips didn't always move when they spoke. Sometimes, one would be silent while the other's reflection mouthed the words instead. When Catherine stood behind them, she swore she could hear faint replies echoing from inside the glass itself, delayed but perfectly clear, as if another version of their voices lived there, waiting to catch up. By evening, the house seemed to hold its breath. The air was colder, sharper, as though the mirror absorbed heat from the room. The twins began playing the game every night after supper, even when their father told them to stop. Gareth was less patient than Catherine. He'd scolded them once for staying up past midnight, only to find the two of them sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide open, staring into the mirror's surface without blinking. He had to shake Isla's shoulder to get her attention, and when she finally turned, she looked dazed, as if pulled from sleepwalking. "We almost got it right," she whispered. "It's hard to talk backwards." The next day, Catherine tried to move the mirror back upstairs. It took both her and Gareth to lift it. It seemed heavier than before, the wood damp and cold to the touch. When they reached the attic door, a sudden crack rang out. The glass hadn't shattered, but a long fracture now split it down the middle, a jagged line that ran from top to bottom like a frozen bolt of lightning. Catherine told herself it was just the cold, that old glass breaks easily in winter. But that night, when she went to bed, she dreamed of the mirror glowing faintly in the dark and two pale faces staring out from behind the crack, whispering in that strange language that had begun to haunt her waking hours. The following week, the twins' behavior changed. They grew quieter, more withdrawn. Meals passed in near silence. When they spoke, it was mostly to each other in their secret tongue. Catherine tried to draw them out with stories, songs, anything to make them laugh, but their smiles came too quickly, too rehearsed. Sometimes, they would stop mid-bite, tilt their heads toward the parlor, and go still, as if listening for something. The house had grown so quiet that every creak of the floorboard sounded like a whisper. One night, unable to sleep, Catherine went downstairs for tea. The fire in the hearth had long burned to embers, but from the parlor came a soft light. She followed it, bare feet brushing over cold stone, and there they were, Isla and Era, kneeling before the cracked mirror, a single candle flickering between them. Their faces were reflected twice, once in the glass, once in the flame. What made Catherine freeze was how the reflections moved, not perfectly in sync, but just slightly behind, their mouths forming the same shapes half a heartbeat later. The girls were murmuring in low tones, their strange language rolling like a chant. Catherine's first instinct was to call their names, but the sound caught in her throat. The candlelight shimmered on the glass, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw other figures behind the twins' reflections, taller shapes, blurred and indistinct, standing where no one else should be. The air grew so cold that her breath came out in pale plumes. She reached for the doorframe to steady herself, and that's when both girls turned their heads toward her at the same time. Their eyes were unfocused, pupils wide and black, as if they were still looking through her rather than at her. Without warning, the candle went out. The parlor plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hiss of wind against the chimney. Then came a soft tapping sound from inside the mirror, like fingernails against glass. Catherine backed away slowly, heart pounding, but before she could move farther, both girls spoke in perfect unison. "Don't break it," they said. "It remembers." She didn't remember climbing the stairs. Gareth later found her sitting on the edge of the bed, trembling, unable to explain what she'd seen. He dismissed it at first, telling her she must have dreamt it, that stress could make anyone hear things in the dark. But when he went to check the parlor himself, the mirror was gone. In its place, he found faint circular marks on the floor, as though it had been dragged, not lifted, across the wood. He searched the attic, the cellar, even the barn, but the mirror was nowhere in the house. The following morning, when the sun finally rose through a haze of frost, he found it again. It was standing against the wall of the twins' bedroom, perfectly upright, though no one had carried it there. The crack was still there, running down the center like a frozen wound. Both girls were asleep in their beds, hands clasped together above the blankets. But what made Gareth's skin crawl was the thin layer of condensation on the mirror's surface, as though someone, or something, had been breathing on the glass from the other side. After that night, neither parent spoke of the incident, but the house seemed to take on a different tone. Shadows clung to corners longer than they should have. Reflections in the window sometimes appeared before the movement that caused them. The twins continued their strange game in secret, their whispers seeping through the floorboards long after the candles were blown out. And every now and then, when Catherine passed their door in the quiet hours before dawn, she would hear that same tapping again, soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind the mirror, counting in a rhythm that didn't belong to any clock in the house. The arrival of the linguist should have brought reason into the house, but instead, it only deepened the strangeness that had already taken root. His name was Dr. Edwin Carter, a quiet, meticulous man from the University of Aberystwyth, who had spent most of his career studying obscure dialects and dying tongues. He'd first heard about the Morgan twins through a letter forwarded by the headmaster of the local school. At first, he thought it was little more than folklore, rural exaggeration about two gifted girls inventing a secret language. But something in the phrasing of the report caught his attention. The structure is consistent, the repetition deliberate, but the source is unknown. Those words gnawed at him until curiosity overpowered skepticism. In late February of 1979, he arrived at the Morgans' farmhouse with a satchel full of notebooks, a portable tape recorder, and the kind of certainty only academics possess before the first crack of fear. The day he came was grey and wet, the sort of Welsh rain that seeps into everything. Catherine met him at the gate, her expression somewhere between relief and dread. She looked thinner than he expected, her skin pale, her hands restless as she led him inside. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic, almost like the aftertaste of a lightning storm. The twins were waiting in the parlor, sitting side by side on the old sofa, their hands folded neatly in their laps. They didn't smile. Their eyes followed him as he entered, unblinking, curious, and calm. Dr. Carter introduced himself, speaking in the practiced tone of a man used to calming nervous subjects. He asked them simple questions at first about their names, their favorite colors, their school. The girls answered politely, their voices soft, melodic. But whenever he tried to steer the conversation toward their language, their manner changed. Their gazes drifted toward each other, their mouths twitching as if suppressing a shared secret. When he asked if they would speak some of it for him, they turned to one another, clasped hands, and began. The sound filled the room like wind through reeds, light, rippling syllables that seemed to move in layers. Carter's initial excitement quickly shifted into bewilderment. The language was unlike anything he'd encountered. It wasn't gibberish, the patterns were too deliberate, the rhythm too precise. There were inflections that hinted at grammar, repeated sounds that marked structure. He jotted symbols furiously into his notebook, trying to keep up, but the flow was relentless. At one point, both girls began speaking at once, their voices overlapping perfectly, each echoing the other half a breath apart, as though two recordings were playing slightly out of sync. He asked if they could translate what they had just said. The twins exchanged a glance, then Isla whispered, "You can't hear it the way we do." Era nodded beside her and added, "You're listening forward. You have to listen backward." That night, Carter set up his recorder in the parlor, determined to capture a clean sample. The girls agreed, though their tone carried an odd amusement, as if indulging him in a game they'd already won. They sat cross-legged on the floor, facing each other, and began to chant softly. The words rose and fell like a tide, cycling through tones that almost formed harmonies. When he played the recording back later, his first reaction was irritation. Something was wrong with the playback. The sound was distorted, the voices stretched thin, like whispers underwater. But when he reversed the tape, his blood ran cold. The reversed audio didn't produce random noise. It formed clear, human speech in English, though the cadence was uncanny, hollow, as if spoken through the mouth of someone mimicking familiarity. It said fragments of sentences, "Behind the glass, we were before, the door is open now." The voices were unmistakably the twins, yet deeper, older, and somehow not entirely their own. When he confronted the girls about it the next morning, they only smiled. "Now you're hearing it right," Era said. "But it's not meant for you." Isla tilted her head, studying him with a kind of pity. "It doesn't like when you record," she added. Carter's academic detachment began to erode after that. He stayed at the farmhouse for 3 days, though each night he slept less and less. The longer he listened to the recordings, the stranger they became. The voices on the tape began to shift subtly, forming patterns that hadn't been there before. He'd play back a section he'd already transcribed, only to find new words emerging from the same track, whispers layered beneath the main sound, faint but coherent. Once, as he listened with headphones, he heard a faint breath directly against his ear, followed by a soft laugh that wasn't on the tape at all. The twins seemed to sense his unease. They watched him constantly, their eyes flicking toward the recorder whenever it was near. They no longer spoke English around him, only their secret language, sometimes breaking into slow, measured chants that vibrated through the floorboards. On the third night, he awoke to find his tape deck playing on its own, the reel spinning backward. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the dial. Through the headphones, he heard their voices again, murmuring over the static. This time, the words were clear, "Don't leave it open." The next morning, Catherine found him in the kitchen, pale and trembling, packing his things. He insisted the tapes had to be taken for study, that he'd uncovered something extraordinary. But his hands shook as he spoke, and when she asked what he'd actually found, he avoided her eyes. As he stepped out into the fog, he glanced back at the house one last time. The twins stood in the upstairs window, identical and still, their faces unreadable. Weeks later, when Dr. Carter returned to the university, he delivered his findings to a colleague. The tapes were nearly blank. The few sounds that remained were faint, soft bursts of static and a barely audible hum, too fragmented to analyze. He swore the recordings had been full of speech, that he had heard their words as clearly as his own heartbeat, but no one believed him. The official report listed the audio as non-linguistic, a meaningless pattern of sounds without identifiable structure. But in the nights that followed, Carter began to hear things when he tried to sleep, the faint rise and fall of the twins' voices, whispering behind the hiss of his tape machine, calling him by name. He destroyed the recordings a week later, burning the tapes in his study fireplace, though he admitted to a friend that it didn't matter. Once, over the phone, his voice shaking, he said, "It's not on the tape anymore. It's in the gaps between sound. It doesn't stop when you stop listening." Back in Corndu, the Morgan twins stopped speaking their strange language altogether. For a brief while, the house seemed quieter, lighter. But every so often, when the wind rolled down from the moors, Catherine would swear she could hear faint laughter echoing through the fields, the same rhythm, the same harmony, carrying a message meant for no one who still lived on this side of the mirror. It was the kind of night that seemed older than the world itself, thick clouds smothering the moon, rain tapping slow and steady against the windows like a warning that went unheard. March had come to Wales, but the thaw never truly arrived. The earth around the Morgans' farmhouse remained slick and dark, and the trees along the edge of the property stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with mist. Inside, the air was cold enough to see your breath. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the only light came from the faint glow of a lamp in the twins' room upstairs. It was on that night, sometime between midnight and dawn, that Isla and Era vanished together, leaving behind a silence that no one in Corndu ever forgot. For days leading up to it, the girls had been different, quieter, yes, but also oddly serene, as if something in them had already settled. Catherine had dared to hope that whatever strange phase they had been trapped in was passing, that they were returning to themselves. They had stopped speaking the strange language. They ate their meals without whispering to each other. They even laughed once or twice, though the sound felt practiced, empty, like an echo of real joy. But at night, the old unease crept back in. The twins no longer shared a bed, not since the mirror had been moved to the attic again, but Catherine could hear them both awake long after midnight, humming in perfect unison, soft, measured notes that carried through the floorboards. When she asked about it, they told her it helped them stay together in the dream. The day before it happened, the air in the house had grown unbearably heavy. Catherine could feel it pressing against her chest, making each breath shallow. Even Gareth seemed unwell, distracted, moving through the motions of his chores without speaking much. He confessed, in a low, almost ashamed tone, that he'd started hearing the twins' voices outside the house, out by the fields, by the stream, sometimes even near the woods. He'd gone looking several times, thinking maybe they'd slipped out to play, but he never found them there. "It's not them," he said finally. "It's just their sound." That evening, the wind came down from the hills, bending the trees low and filling the air with the smell of rain and iron. Catherine tried to keep the lamps lit, but the flames kept shrinking, as if the air itself was refusing to hold fire. The twins had gone upstairs early. Around 11, Catherine went to check on them. She found them sitting cross-legged on their beds, each holding one end of the same ribbon, a pale grey ribbon she didn't recognize. They looked up as she entered, calm and expressionless. "It's time to go soon," Isla said. "It's calling us back." Catherine tried to laugh, tried to keep her voice light, but her throat closed around the words. Era tilted her head, her eyes unblinking. "We'll be together this time," she said softly. "You don't have to look for us." When Catherine told Gareth, he brushed it off as another of their strange games, though she saw the fear flicker in his eyes. He checked the locks, banked the fire, and set a chair against the front door just in case. Neither of them slept. Around 2 in the morning, a sharp sound echoed through the house, metal scraping against stone. Gareth grabbed the lantern and went to look, but the moment he reached the bottom of the stairs, the air changed. It felt charged, humming faintly, as though every wall was vibrating. From upstairs came laughter, bright and high, echoing in perfect rhythm, and beneath it, a strange droning hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. They rushed to the twins' room, but when Catherine flung the door open, the room was empty. The beds were neatly made, the window wide open though the storm howled outside. The ribbon lay on the floor, coiled like a shed snake's skin. The lantern light flickered, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls, and that's when they saw it, the mirror, the same one they'd locked in the attic, standing against the far wall. Its glass was fractured, the crack down the center wider now, almost a split. The reflection in it was wrong. It showed the room perfectly, but in the reflected version, the beds were empty, the window closed, and standing between the 2 reflected beds were the twins, hand in hand, faces calm, eyes dark as slate. Catherine screamed their names, reaching toward the mirror, but Gareth pulled her back. The reflection didn't move with her, it lingered a moment too long, as if the image had a heartbeat of its own. Then came the sound of footsteps, small, quick, descending the stairs below. Gareth spun, lantern raised, but the moment he stepped into the hallway, every light in the house went out. The only thing left was sound, the creak of the front door opening, the rush of wind, and the laughter again, farther away now, carried through the rain like a song. When the lamps were relit, the twins were gone. Their footprints led from the stairs to the threshold, then out across the yard. 2 sets of bare, small prints in the mud, side by side, heading toward the woods at the edge of the property. Catherine and Gareth followed them as far as the stream, calling their names into the dark. The wind swallowed every word. The prints stopped at the bank, the earth disturbed as if they had stepped into the water. There were no prints on the opposite side, no sign of struggle, no sign of anyone else. Only silence and the slow ripple of black water reflecting the lantern light like shattered glass. By dawn, the search had begun. The villagers, reluctant but compelled, combed the woods, calling out until their voices grew hoarse. The police came later that day, trudging through the sodden ground with dogs and torches. They found nothing, no clothing, no footprints beyond those that ended by the stream, no sign the girls had gone farther. But in the attic of the farmhouse, they found something else. The mirror returned to its place against the far wall, the crack sealed as if it had never existed. The surface was clean except for 2 small handprints pressed into the glass, side by side, faint but unmistakable. The official story was that the twins had wandered off and gotten lost in the storm. Search parties scoured the hills for a week before giving up. But the villagers whispered something different. Some said they still heard voices near the woods when the mist rolled in, soft, lilting tones rising and falling in perfect harmony. Others claimed that, on certain nights, the farmhouse windows glowed faintly from within, though no one had lived there since. Catherine and Gareth left Corndu soon after, unable to bear the silence. Yet those who stayed swore that when the wind turned cold, you could still hear laughter drifting down from the hills, the same laughter that had once filled the farmhouse, now distant and thin, speaking in a language no one living could ever hope to understand.